December 14th, 2025. 3 a.m. Zaporizhzhia Oblast, southern Ukraine. 14 combat engineers, 3 overlapping minefields, 0 room for error. In the next 97 minutes, these men would do what 2 previous Ukrainian assault groups had failed to accomplish. They would punch a corridor through the most heavily fortified minefield complex on the entire southern front. And behind them, waiting in concealed tree lines 2 kilometers back, a company of German-built Leopard 2A4 main battle tanks would exploit that corridor before the Russians even understood what was happening. But first, someone had to walk into the mines. I'm your host at Warfist TV, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down one of the most audacious breach operations of the entire Ukraine-Russia war. A localized assault south of Orikhiv that combined old-school combat engineering with cutting-edge electronic warfare, remote-controlled demining vehicles, and a level of individual courage that borders on incomprehensible. This is the story of Ukrainian sappers who dismounted under direct machine gun fire to clear mines by hand. And it's the story of a Russian defensive line that looked impenetrable on satellite imagery, but crumbled in under 2 hours. Let's break it down. To understand what happened on the morning of December 14th, you have to understand the terrain south of Orikhiv and why it mattered. Orikhiv sits roughly 75 kilometers southwest of Zaporizhzhia city, in a stretch of flat, open steppe that has been a focal point of Ukrainian offensive planning since mid-2023. The area gained international attention during Ukraine's summer 2023 counteroffensive, when multiple assault waves attempted to push through Russian defensive lines toward Tokmak and eventually toward the Sea of Azov. Those attacks achieved limited gains at significant cost. The flat terrain, dense minefields, and overlapping fields of fire from Russian positions made every meter of advance brutally expensive. By late 2025, the situation had evolved, but the fundamental challenge remained. Russian engineers had spent months reinforcing existing defenses south of Orikhiv. Intelligence assessments from Ukrainian military planners, corroborated by satellite imagery analysis, identified 3 distinct minefield belts stretching across a 4-kilometer-wide sector. The first belt sat roughly 800 meters ahead of the Ukrainian forward positions. It consisted primarily of TM-62 anti-tank mines with a scattering of PMN-2 anti-personnel mines deployed in irregular patterns designed to slow dismounted clearance. Behind it, roughly 350 meters further south, a second belt incorporated a mix of TM-62S and more modern PTKM-1R top-attack anti-tank mines, the kind that detect approaching vehicles and launch a projectile to strike thin roof armor from above. The third belt, another 400 meters deeper, was reinforced with concrete dragon's teeth anti-vehicle obstacles and a continuous anti-tank ditch, roughly 3 meters deep and 4 meters wide. Between and behind these belts, Russian forces had established mutually supporting firing positions. At least 4 heavy machine gun nests covered the approaches. A mortar battery, assessed as 82mm tubes, sat roughly 1,200 meters behind the third belt. And crucially, Russian FPV drone operators had been active in this sector for weeks, using small first-person view kamikaze drones to strike anything that moved in the open ground between the lines. 2 previous Ukrainian probing attacks in November had stalled at the first minefield belt. In one attempt, a mine-clearing vehicle struck a PTKM-1R mine and was disabled within 40 seconds of entering the belt. In the other, infantry attempting to advance on foot took mortar fire so accurate that commanders suspected the Russians had pre-registered every approach route. The sector looked impenetrable. Russian commanders apparently believed it was. Intercepted communications from late November suggest that the local Russian battalion commander had described the defensive zone south of Orikhiv as, quote, a fortress belt that no vehicle could cross. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Which element was most critical to the breach? A. The mine-clearing rockets. B. The electronic warfare umbrella. C. The sappers who cleared the last 40 meters by hand. Drop your answer in the comments. Ukrainian planning for the breach operation began in late November 2025. The operation was designated internally within the brigade as a localized breakthrough assault, not a full-scale offensive, but a precision strike aimed at punching through a narrow corridor and establishing a foothold that could be expanded over the following days. The assault group was assembled from elements of a mechanized brigade with attached combat engineer specialists. The force composition reflected hard lessons learned from earlier failed attempts. The core of the assault group consisted of 14 combat engineers organized into 3 clearance teams. Team 1 would operate with the UR-77 Meteorit mine clearing system, a tracked vehicle that fires a line charge across a minefield. The line charge is essentially a long rope of explosive that, when detonated, creates a blast wave strong enough to detonate or displace mines across a corridor roughly 6 meters wide and up to 100 meters long. Team 2 would operate a remote-controlled demining vehicle, a modified tracked platform designed to physically trigger mines by rolling over them, clearing a path through pure mechanical force. Team 3 was the dismounted clearance team, sappers equipped with prodding rods, mine detectors, and hand tools. They were the contingency plan, the last resort if the mechanical and rocket-based systems failed to complete the corridor. Supporting the engineers was a reinforced infantry platoon tasked with providing suppressive fire and securing the flanks of the corridor once it was opened. Behind them, positioned in concealed fighting positions 2 kilometers north under camouflage netting and natural tree cover, sat a company of 4 Leopard 2A4 main battle tanks. These tanks, part of Western military aid packages, brought 120mm Rheinmetall smoothbore cannons and composite armor significantly superior to anything in the Russian defensive positions. Their role was straightforward. The moment the corridor was open, they would push through at maximum speed, bypass the minefield complex, and establish an armored foothold on the southern side before Russian reserves could react. But none of that mattered if the corridor never opened. The key innovation in the December 14th plan was timing and electronic warfare. Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists had been studying Russian FPV drone activity in the sector for 3 weeks. They mapped the frequencies used by Russian drone operators, identified their control stations' approximate locations, and prepared a targeted jamming package. The plan called for activating this electronic warfare umbrella precisely at 2:50 a.m., 10 minutes before the breach operation launched. The jamming would suppress Russian FPV drone signals across a roughly 2-kilometer radius centered on the minefield complex. Without their drones, the Russians would lose their most responsive anti-vehicle capability in the sector. They would still have mortars, machine guns, and conventional anti-tank weapons, but the drone operators who had stopped previous Ukrainian advances would be effectively blinded. The timing was not arbitrary. 3 a.m. in mid-December in southern Ukraine means total darkness. Sunrise would not come until approximately 7:50 a.m. The assault group needed darkness both for concealment and for the thermal imaging advantage that Ukrainian night vision and drone equipment provided over the Russian defenders, but they also needed the corridor completed before dawn. Once daylight arrived, the entire open ground between the minefields would become a shooting gallery, and any vehicles caught in the corridor would be visible to Russian anti-tank teams at ranges exceeding a kilometer. The window was roughly 4 hours and 50 minutes. 4 hours and 50 minutes to breach 3 minefields, an anti-tank ditch, and a row of dragon's teeth. It was an aggressive timeline, and it almost wasn't enough. Stay with me. What happens in the next 97 minutes rewrites the tactical playbook for minefield breaching in modern warfare. At 2:47 a.m., Ukrainian electronic warfare systems powered up. The jamming signal blanketed the target sector. On the Russian side, FPV drone operators reported sudden signal loss. Their video feeds dissolved into static. Control links dropped. In the space of 3 minutes, every Russian FPV drone in the sector became useless. At 2:55 a.m., the UR-77 Meteorit vehicle moved forward from its concealed position. The tracked vehicle, based on a modified 2S1 Gvozdika chassis, advanced approximately 300 meters toward the first minefield belt. Its 2-man crew worked in near-total darkness, navigating by thermal optics. At 3:01 a.m., the vehicle halted. Team 1 confirmed alignment with the planned breach axis. At 3:03 a.m., the first line charge fired. The UR-77 launched a rocket-propelled explosive line that arced across the night sky and landed across the first minefield belt. The charge stretched roughly 93 meters across the mine-contaminated ground. 2 seconds later, the charge detonated. The blast was enormous. A wall of fire and concussive force swept across the minefield, detonating TM-62 mines in a chain of secondary explosions that lit up the steppe. The blast corridor was approximately 6 meters wide, enough for a single vehicle to pass through. On the Russian side, the explosion triggered immediate alarm. The mortar battery behind the third belt opened fire within 4 minutes, dropping 82mm rounds across the general area of the first minefield. But without drone reconnaissance, the mortar crew was firing on pre-registered coordinates, not adjusting to actual Ukrainian positions. The rounds fell roughly 150 meters east of the actual breach corridor, close enough to hear, not close enough to stop anyone. At 3:09 a.m., the UR-77 crew reloaded. The Meteorit system carries 2 line charges. The vehicle advanced through the corridor in the first belt and repositioned for a shot at the second minefield. At 3:14 a.m., the second line charge fired. It landed across the second belt and detonated, triggering a cascade of explosions as TM-62 and PTKM-1R mines cooked off in the blast wave. The corridor through the second belt was narrower than the first, estimated at roughly 5 meters because the line charge had drifted slightly in a crosswind, but it was enough. 2 belts down. Elapsed time, 11 minutes. The mortar fire intensified. Russian infantry in positions flanking the minefield complex opened up with PKM machine guns, firing sustained bursts into the darkness toward the sound of the explosions. Tracer rounds streaked across the open ground in long, arcing patterns. The Russian gunners couldn't see the Ukrainian assault group, but they were hosing down the general area with suppressive fire. One burst passed within 30 meters of the UR-77 vehicle. The Ukrainian infantry platoon responded. From positions on both flanks, they opened fire on the identified machine gun nests using thermal-equipped rifles and a mounted AGS-17 automatic grenade launcher. The AGS-17, firing 30mm grenades at a rate of roughly 350 rounds per minute, hammered the nearest Russian machine gun position. The firing from that position ceased within seconds, but the third belt remained. At 3:19 a.m., Team 2 advanced the remote-controlled demining vehicle toward the third minefield. This vehicle, a modified tracked platform roughly the size of a large industrial mower, was designed to physically roll across mines, absorbing the blast with its reinforced undercarriage and clearing a path by detonation. The operator controlled it from roughly 400 meters behind, using a wired connection that was immune to the electronic warfare jamming affecting the sector. The vehicle entered the third belt at 3:22 a.m. It advanced roughly 12 meters into the minefield, detonating 2 TM-62 mines in quick succession. The blasts sent geysers of frozen earth into the air, but the vehicle kept moving. Then, at 3:24 a.m., it struck something heavier. A massive explosion lifted the front of the vehicle off the ground. The blast was inconsistent with a standard TM-62. Post-operation analysis suggests it was either a double-stacked mine or a buried improvised explosive device with an enhanced charge. The remote-controlled vehicle was disabled. Its tracks sheared off on the left side, and it slewed to a halt in the middle of the minefield, burning. The corridor through the third belt was incomplete. Roughly 12 meters had been cleared, but between the disabled vehicle and the anti-tank ditch on the far side lay at least 40 meters of uncleared minefield. This was the moment the operation could have failed. How many vehicles did Ukraine ultimately push through the completed corridor? A, 4, B, 7, C, 12. The answer comes at the end. At 3:26 a.m., the assault group commander made a decision that will likely be studied in military engineering courses for years. He ordered 2 sappers from Team 3 to dismount and clear the remaining 40 meters by hand. By hand, in an active minefield, under mortar and machine gun fire, in darkness. The 2 engineers who volunteered have not been publicly identified. Ukrainian operational security around this event remains tight as of early 2026. What is known from after-action reports and brigade-level briefings is that they were experienced combat engineers, both with prior deployments in mined sectors. They carried mine prodding rods, handheld mine detectors, and marking tape. They wore standard infantry body armor. Against anti-tank mines, body armor provides essentially zero protection. A TM-62 mine contains roughly 7 kilograms of TNT. A human being stepping on one does not survive. They knew this. At 3:28 a.m., the 2 sappers crossed the 12-meter corridor cleared by the disabled demining vehicle and entered the uncleared section of the third belt. Working by feel and by the faint glow of their helmet-mounted infrared lights, visible only through night vision equipment, they began probing the frozen ground ahead of them. Each probe meant pushing a thin metal rod into the earth at an angle, feeling for the hard surface of a mine casing. One probe every 30 centimeters. Move, probe, move, probe. Russian mortar fire continued falling across the sector. One round landed within 70 meters of the two sappers. The blast wave knocked frozen dirt across their position, but neither was injured. The machine gun fire from the flanking Russian positions had been partially suppressed by the Ukrainian infantry platoon, but sporadic bursts still cracked overhead. The sappers could hear the snap of passing rounds. Subscribe to Warfist TV if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. This is not Hollywood. This is two men on their hands and knees in a minefield while machine gun tracers pass over their heads. At 3:34 a.m., 6 minutes into the manual clearance, the lead sapper's prodding rod struck metal. He froze. Working with practiced movements, he carefully excavated the soil around the object, a TM-62 anti-tank mine, buried approximately 15 centimeters below the surface. He marked its position with tape and probed a path around it. The detour cost 2 minutes and added a slight curve to the corridor, but the mine was bypassed without incident. At 3:41 a.m., 13 minutes in, the second sapper identified another mine. This one was shallower, barely 10 centimeters below the surface, possibly shifted upward by frost heave in the cold December ground. The same procedure: mark, bypass, continue. The cleared corridor was not straight. It zigzagged around identified mines, creating a path barely 4 meters wide in places. Tank drivers would need precise guidance to navigate it, but it was a path. Meter by meter, it was a path. At 3:50 a.m., the sappers reached the anti-tank ditch. 22 minutes of manual mine clearance, 40 meters of frozen earth, probed one rod length at a time. The longest 22 minutes of 2 men's lives. But the anti-tank ditch presented a new problem. 3 meters deep, 4 meters wide, with steep sides. A Leopard 2 A4 main battle tank weighs roughly 55 tons. It cannot simply drive through a ditch of that depth. The assault plan had accounted for this. An armored vehicle-launched bridge, an AVLB, was positioned behind the tank company. But the bridge layer needed the corridor to be fully secure before advancing. At 3:52 a.m., the sappers signaled corridor clear. The infantry platoon immediately pushed forward through all 3 belts, securing positions on both sides of the corridor to prevent Russian infantry from mining it again or ambushing vehicles in transit. Ukrainian drone operators flying reconnaissance UAVs above the sector confirmed that Russian forces behind the third belt appeared to be repositioning but had not yet mounted a coordinated counterattack. The electronic warfare umbrella was holding. Russian FPV drones remained grounded. If you believe tactics win wars, type Warfist TV in the comments, because what happened next proves that point beyond any doubt. At 4:04 a.m., the bridge-laying vehicle advanced through the corridor. It was a tense transit. The zigzagging path through the third belt required the driver to follow infantry guides, walking ahead with infrared markers. The vehicle cleared the third belt without incident and deployed its bridge across the anti-tank ditch at 4:11 a.m. The bridge, a folding metal span, dropped across the gap in approximately 3 minutes. At 4:14 a.m., the corridor was fully open. At 4:17 a.m., the first Leopard 2 A4 main battle tank entered the corridor. The Leopard 2 A4 is a 55-ton German-designed main battle tank with a 120mm Rheinmetall L-44 smoothbore gun, composite armor on the hull and turret front, and a 1,500 horsepower MTU diesel engine that can push the vehicle to speeds exceeding 68 kilometers per hour on roads. In the confines of a minefield corridor, the driver held the speed to roughly 15 kilometers per hour, following the infrared markers placed by infantry guides. The tank's tracks chewed through frozen earth as it navigated the zigzag path through the third belt. At 4:19 a.m., the first Leopard cleared the bridge and emerged on the southern side of the minefield complex. By 4:28 a.m., all 4 Leopard 2 A4 tanks in the company had pushed through the corridor and deployed into a battle formation on the far side. 2 additional infantry fighting vehicles followed, carrying dismounted infantry to establish defensive positions around the foothold. Russian reaction was slow. The mortar battery continued firing but had not adjusted its aim. The machine gun positions on the flanks had been suppressed or abandoned, and critically, no Russian armored reserve appeared. post-operation intelligence analysis suggests the nearest Russian armored reserve, a company of T-72B3 tanks, was positioned roughly 8 kilometers to the southeast and required at least 45 minutes to reach the breach sector over unprepared roads. The Russian battalion commander in the immediate sector had apparently not requested armored reinforcement until after the Ukrainian tanks were already through the corridor, a delay that Ukrainian commanders attribute to confusion about the scale of the breach and continued disruption of Russian communications by electronic warfare. By 4:45 a.m., Ukrainian forces held a foothold roughly 600 meters deep and 400 meters wide on the southern side of the minefield complex. The Leopard 2A4 tanks had taken hold-down positions behind natural terrain folds, their guns oriented south toward the expected avenue of Russian counterattack. Infantry had dug in around the tanks. Additional ammunition and supplies were being pushed through the corridor. Dawn arrived at approximately 7:50 a.m. By that time, the foothold had been expanded to roughly 900 meters deep. Russian forces attempted 2 counterattacks during the morning. The first, at approximately 8:15 a.m., involved a platoon of Russian infantry supported by 2 BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles advancing from the southeast. The lead BMP-2 was engaged by the Ukrainian Leopard 2A4 company commander's tank at a range of approximately 1,400 meters. The 120mm APF-SDS round, a dart-like kinetic penetrator traveling at roughly 1,750 meters per second, struck the BMP-2 in the hull. The vehicle erupted in a fireball as its ammunition detonated. The second BMP-2 reversed and withdrew. The infantry scattered. The second counterattack at approximately 10:30 a.m. was more serious. 3 Russian T-72B3 tanks from the reserve company advanced toward the foothold supported by dismounted infantry. Ukrainian drone operators, now flying FPV drones of their own through gaps in the electronic warfare coverage, engaged the leading T-72B3 with a kamikaze drone strike. The drone, carrying a modified RPG warhead, struck the tank's turret roof. The thin armor on the T-72's turret roof, typically between 15 and 40 millimeters depending on the variant, could not stop the shaped charge. The warhead penetrated into the fighting compartment. The tank's autoloader magazine, a carousel containing propellant charges beneath the turret ring, detonated. The turret was blown completely off the hull and landed roughly 20 meters away. A catastrophic kill. The remaining 2 T-72B3s halted their advance. One fired 2 rounds at the Ukrainian positions, both missing. Ukrainian counter-battery radar detected the muzzle flash and relayed coordinates. A PZH-2000 self-propelled howitzer, positioned roughly 9 kilometers behind the Ukrainian lines, fired 3 155mm precision-guided rounds. The first round landed within 8 meters of the lead surviving T-72B3. The second struck the ground directly beside the tank's hull. The concussive force disabled the vehicle's tracks and apparently injured the crew, as the tank was abandoned within minutes. The third T-72 reversed at full speed and disappeared behind a terrain fold. By noon on December 14th, the Russian counterattacks had been repelled. Ukrainian forces held a foothold that continued to expand over the following 48 hours. Combat footage verified by Ukrainian sources shows the destroyed BMP-2 and the turretless T-72B3 still burning well into the afternoon. What would NATO planners have done differently in this breach? Would a larger-scale assault have been worth the risk? Drop your tactical analysis in the comments. The total Russian losses in the December 14th breach and the subsequent counterattacks are assessed by Ukrainian General Staff reports as follows. 1 T-72. B-3 main battle tank catastrophically destroyed. 1 T-72B3 disabled and abandoned. 1 BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle destroyed. 2 machine gun positions neutralized. An estimated 40 to 55 Russian personnel killed or wounded across the minefield defenders, the mortar battery crew, and the counterattack forces. The mortar battery was eventually silenced by Ukrainian counter-battery fire later on December 14th, with OSINT investigators identifying impact craters consistent with 155mm howitzer rounds at the battery's assessed position. The estimated value of destroyed and abandoned Russian equipment exceeds $8 million, a conservative estimate based on replacement costs for the T-72B3 and BMP-2 platforms alone. Ukrainian losses during the breach operation itself were remarkably light. No vehicles were lost during the corridor transit. The remote-controlled demining vehicle destroyed in the third minefield was the only equipment loss. 3 Ukrainian personnel suffered minor injuries from mortar shrapnel during the initial breach phase. The 2 sappers who manually cleared the 40-meter corridor through the third belt were uninjured. 0 combat fatalities in the assault group during the breach itself. That statistic alone speaks to the quality of planning, the effectiveness of the electronic warfare umbrella, and the raw skill of the combat engineers involved. The breach south of Orikhiv on December 14, 2025, offers several critical tactical lessons that both sides of this war and military analysts worldwide are still studying. First, electronic warfare is now a precondition for ground maneuver. The suppression of Russian FPV drones was not a supporting element of this operation. It was the enabling condition. Previous Ukrainian attempts to breach these same minefields had failed in large part because Russian drone operators could identify and strike clearance vehicles within minutes. By neutralizing the drone threat for a window of several hours, Ukrainian EW specialists created the permissive environment that the engineers needed. Without that umbrella, the UR-77 Meteorit would likely have been targeted by FPV drones before firing its first line charge. The lesson is clear. In 2025 and beyond, you cannot breach a defended minefield without first winning the electromagnetic battle. Drones have fundamentally changed the calculus of engineering operations under fire. Second, mechanical clearance systems have limits, and human sappers remain irreplaceable. The remote-controlled demining vehicle failed. It was disabled 13 meters into the third belt. If the assault plan had relied entirely on mechanical and rocket-based clearance, the operation would have stalled at that point. The corridor would have remained incomplete, and the tanks waiting behind the lines would never have advanced. It was the decision to send 2 human sappers into the minefield that salvaged the operation. 22 minutes of manual clearance under fire. This is a capability that no robot, no line charge, and no remote-controlled vehicle can fully replace. The human sapper, with a prodding rod and steady nerves, remains the ultimate insurance policy in minefield breaching. Military doctrine writers from Kyiv to Washington are taking note. Third, combined arms synchronization won the battle, not any single weapon system. The operation succeeded because every element worked in concert. Electronic warfare suppressed drones. The UR-77 cleared the first 2 belts. The remote vehicle bought 12 meters in the third belt. Sappers completed the corridor by hand. Infantry suppressed machine gun positions. Tanks exploited the breach immediately. Artillery crushed the counterattack. Drone operators delivered the killing blow on the T-72B3. Remove any one of these elements and the operation fails. This is combined arms warfare at its finest, a doctrine that Ukraine has been refining under fire for nearly 4 years. Fourth, Russian defensive planning exhibited a critical vulnerability. The minefield complex was formidable in physical terms: 3 belts, dragon's teeth, and anti-tank ditch. But the defense lacked depth in reactive capability. The nearest armored reserve was 8 kilometers away. The mortar battery fired on pre-registered coordinates without adjustment. The local commander failed to request reinforcement until the breach was already complete. Russian defensive doctrine relied on the minefields themselves as the primary barrier, with insufficient mobile reserves to respond to a breach. This is a systemic issue in Russian defensive operations across the southern front, a preference for static fortification over mobile reaction forces. Ukrainian commanders are learning to exploit this gap, and the Orikhiv breach demonstrates exactly how. Fifth, timing and surprise remain decisive. The operation launched at 3 a.m. in total darkness under an electronic warfare umbrella that had been activated only minutes before. The Russians had no warning. Their first indication of the breach was the detonation of the UR-77 line charge, by which point the operation was already underway and the drone suppression was in effect. By the time Russian commanders understood what was happening, the corridor was open and Ukrainian armor was rolling through: speed, surprise, and darkness. These ancient principles of warfare remain as relevant in 2025 as they were in 1944. Real tactics, real consequences. Warfist TV. Now, the answer to our earlier question: how many vehicles did Ukraine push through the completed corridor? The answer is B. 7. 4. Leopard 2. 4 main battle tanks and 2 infantry fighting vehicles transited the corridor in the initial push, followed by the bridge-laying vehicle that remained at the anti-tank ditch. 7 vehicles through a corridor that was, in places, barely 4 meters wide, zigzagging around unexploded mines in the pre-dawn darkness, every driver navigating by infrared markers placed by infantry walking ahead of them. Every crew knowing that a single wrong turn meant driving onto a live anti-tank mine containing 7 kilograms of TNT. 7 vehicles, 0 losses. That is the result of planning, training, and courage operating together. 3 questions worth considering. Was the decision to send 2 sappers into the 3rd minefield on foot the right call? Or should commanders have waited for a replacement demining vehicle, even if it meant losing the darkness window? Could the Russian local commander have prevented this breach if he had positioned his armored reserve closer to the minefield complex, say within 2 kilometers instead of 8? And finally, what would you have done differently? If you were the Ukrainian assault group commander at 3:24 a.m., standing in the darkness with a disabled demining vehicle, an incomplete corridor, and 4 Leopard tanks waiting behind you with a narrowing window before dawn, what order would you have given? Subscribe to Warfist TV, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The steppe south of Orikhiv is quiet now. The snow has covered the blast craters. The burned-out hulk of the T-72B3 sits where it died, turret ring empty, hatches open to the winter sky. The corridor through the minefields has been widened and reinforced, Ukrainian engineers working through the following weeks to turn a desperate 4-meter path into a proper supply route. The foothold has expanded. The line has moved. But somewhere in that frozen ground, there are still mines. And somewhere in a Ukrainian barracks, 2 combat engineers carry the memory of 22 minutes that no training exercise can replicate. 22 minutes on their knees in a minefield, probing frozen earth 1 rod length at a time, while machine gun tracers drew bright lines above their heads. Modern warfare punishes hesitation. It punishes overconfidence, and it punishes commanders who believe that static defenses alone can stop determined soldiers with the right plan and the will to execute it. The mines are still there. The lessons are still being learned. Stay vigilant.